that being said, I would like to ask a round of applause for our next speaker. That is John deRoulet, Head of Revenue Management at Wheelhouse, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Antonio.
So the stage is all yours.
Hi, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and get invited back. This is one of my favorite conferences in the space. The opportunity to chat with everyone and really make connections is really great. Okay, so the clicker works. My name is John deRoulet. I'm the head of revenue management education at Wheelhouse. If you don't know who Wheelhouse is, we are a revenue management platform, an RMS system. And I've been with Wheelhouse about 5 years. I get an opportunity to chat with folks about revenue management and revenue management strategy. And prior to my time at Wheelhouse, really most of my career, or the entirety of my career in this space, has been as a revenue manager. Prior to Wheelhouse, I worked at an organization called Stay Alfred, back when we were just a little 100-unit property management company. And I helped them grow to over 3,000 properties across 30 cities in the United States, and actually built and led that revenue management team, taking it from just myself to a team of 10 members. So in that time, I've had an opportunity to really just get to experience revenue management for kind of all phases of company growth. And today what I wanted to talk to you about is another market data thing. I know we've had a lot of great sessions on market data, and I'm going to give you another one. Hopefully it's just as good, but this is going to be a little different. I'm not actually going to share any market data with you guys today. I'm going to talk to you more about the conceptual kind of approach you need as a revenue manager when you're thinking of using market data. More and more as this industry develops, we see people talking about what's going on in the market, how their performance is, things like that. And I think, whether you have a revenue manager or not, we often think of the market as being this like great objective kind of thing. It's there, it'll tell us the truth, all of that stuff. But in reality, there's a lot that you have to do with the data to get anything out of it. And even though revenue managers are people who do analytics, they work with numbers, in a lot of ways they're storytellers as well. So this first kind of part is the market the truth? I hear that a lot from folks. They talk about, hey, the truth of what's going on is going to be in the market data. It's there, right? Like, we just have to look at the market data. But if you're like me, who, watched some of the great presentations today, there's a lot of data out there, and how that actually applies to you is a more complicated thing than just kind of looking at the data and knowing how you're doing. So one of the questions I think about is, if there is an objective market, we can only really guess at it subjectively, right? I mentioned that aspect of revenue managers are storytellers. And even though we know that, like, if we could see the entirety of the market, we could understand everything that's going on, we might know our exact place in it, we really don't have the opportunity to know everything at once. So we have to be able to tell a story. I kind of make a joke, and we'll see if it lands. I don't know if I've been able to figure it out, but like, I know that market agnostic is a term that actually means something, but when someone says it to me, I kind of think about it like in the religious sense. It's like, I'm an agnostic. I know that the market exists, but I don't really know what it is, And so when we're working with market data, I think a big key to understanding how to work with it is that you have to be really intentional about the assumptions that you're making, right? And because we think of the market as truth, we kind of forget, or when I talk to a lot of folks, we forget that we actually are making assumptions all the time about what we're comparing to, about what's important to our portfolios or our properties. And being intentional about those assumptions is really, really key for an effective revenue manager or even an effective business leader in being able to actually use market data to explain anything. There's a couple quotes I think of which I think maybe drive this home. These are quotes that other analytics leaders have said to me, but one of them is, if I torture the data long enough, I can make it say anything. And there are 3 kinds of lies. lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think what that kind of reminds us is that even though the market is truth, we are actually having a big effect on what we're showing and what we're choosing to show and what we're choosing to compare to. And the outputs you get from that are going to be wildly different. And it's really imperative for a revenue manager or any business leader to be highly intentional and highly aware of how they are affecting what they're trying to show when using market data, right? It's not enough to just grab data out of any of these platforms and send it to owners or send it to your boss or make a decision off of it, because you can get wildly different perspectives depending on what data you choose to look at, what data you choose to compare to, that sort of thing. So we'll ask the question, what even is the market? And I'll pause here for a moment because I'm going to have some slides here that are like a brutal wall of text. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the entirety of the slide. I do that so if you request the slide deck later, there's actually useful information there for you to kind of look into. So if you see a slide that stresses you out, just don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But what even is the market, right? You know, the market, to use kind of like more technical terminology, is the environment where basically every accommodation is available for sale and every person who's purchasing an accommodation is also looking for those things. And all of those things are competing at once. You have different guests at different times who are looking to purchase accommodations. You have a lot of different kinds of accommodations. And along with that, you have the suppliers who are also setting rates to try to sell these properties. So it's this big, giant network and web of things for sale, people purchasing, and they all have different criteria of what they're trying to do. The thing I think that's most important about our market in short-term rentals and vacation rentals is that we have a very, very kind of unstable marketplace. If you look at things like hotels or like airlines, the product being sold can be broken down in really stable ways. Hotels have chain scales, so they organize quality and exactly what is going on. Airlines, you're selling the same seat even though there's only a few tiers of what's available. In our space, we have a wide variety of properties available, right? In a wide variety of locations at a lot of different price points. We have a lot of different suppliers in the space offering similar properties at different price points. So it's very, very hard to get a just stable perspective of what your market is. And that's where I'm kind of like trying to drill in this idea is that you have a lot of control over that when you're using market data, and you actually have a responsibility to be aware of what you're comparing to. Because for us, the marketplace is fractured, diverse, and inconsistent. And on top of that, it's constantly changing. And if we want to get even a little bit worse, our market that we look at, a lot of us will look at market data for short-term rentals and vacation rentals, but the consumers who are purchasing our product are probably also looking at other products that we don't call our market when we're pulling that data in. We know that if you came here to Rome and you looked at vacation rentals or short-term rentals, you probably also were looking at hotels and aware of what they were offering. There's other kinds of accommodations that we tend to not look at, but that are also influencing our marketplace. So in our space, market data is not only very diverse in terms of the product, diverse in terms of the suppliers that are offering different rates with different reasons for it, different priorities, different owners with different priorities. But the market data itself is also fairly imperfect currently. Now, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been getting a lot better at doing this. There's a ton of great providers that are all working in this space to give us a better data environment to describe this very fractured marketplace. But at the end of the day, we don't have a single source of data that combines all of the actuals in our space, right? There is no Smith Travel Research, which even then for hotels doesn't have all of the data for hotels. So our data is split among PMSs, RMSs, data providers, and the property managers themselves. In addition to that, the variety of the product is probably the most difficult aspect of using market data in our space. We are always looking to aggregate some differences in properties to make a comparison when you're using market data in your own practice, right? It's very rare that you have the opportunity to say, I'm going to get enough data from the exact same kind of property with the exact same floor plan in the exact same location. Raise your hand if you have an opportunity to do that. I think it's very rare. In fact, most often we are looking at properties that are similar enough, but we are making choices to say, hey, I'm going to look at properties that are different, but I think they're similar enough to be indicative of something that I can use for the market data. The last piece, too, I do want to bring up is we also have scrape data. And this is kind of a good thing and a bad thing, right? I think a lot of people look at scrape data as a negative because it's not always fully accurate. But it is also a benefit we have in our space that we can infer information about the market, particularly occupancy and stuff like that from scrape data. So for one, it allows us to fill some gaps, but it's not going to give us the exact information that actuals would give us, right? So I think it's both a benefit and kind of a negative in our space. I generally see it as a benefit that we have access to scrape data that can give us inferences on what's going on because this marketplace is so fragmented. But it's also something that we have to understand because you have to take it with a grain of salt to some degree, right? There are assumptions that the data providers who are looking and collecting scrape data, they're making about the properties, and you have to be aware that not only are you making assumptions about what to compare your stuff to, but those data providers are also making assumptions. And if you're not aware of them, it may give you a different impression than what's actually going on, right? So, long story short here, the assumptions we're making are critical. They're absolutely critical, and you're making them all the time whenever you use market data. Right? If you looked at some of the other presentations that shared market data with us at the conference, a lot of you are probably thinking, like, this is very interesting to me, but I can't just take this and send this to an owner. Like, that doesn't, like, give them the story I'm trying to tell them. And so if you are going to go and take your own market data, you're probably thinking, like, how would I make this relevant to me? How would I make this relevant to my owners? I think I said this at the beginning, but you know, a lot of people think of revenue managers as pure analysts, and we are, right? Revenue managers are working with numbers, but more so than that, a great revenue manager is often a communicator in your organization, right? They're telling stories, and we're using data to tell stories, and that means it's not always so much like exactly what the data is, it's how you connect it to what you're trying to do, and if you're not aware of like what you're trying to do or what the implications of it are, the data's not going to be that helpful, right? So to give you just an example of that, if I ask the question, how's our occupancy, or maybe my boss asked it to me, how's our occupancy compared to the market, that can actually mean a number of things, right? Very easily, you might just say, oh, well, here's the occupancy of every single property in the entire greater Rome area, and I'm going to compare it to my occupancy in my portfolio. But you all probably know that's not what you actually mean. You probably mean, what is the occupancy in this specific area of Rome? Or what is the occupancy within a kilometer of the majority of my properties? Or maybe it means, what is the occupancy of other professional providers? There's a lot of depth in those questions, and you need to be aware when you're using market data, what question you're actually answering and what question you're asking. So, pretty short here. Just a few considerations for using market data is, the number one thing I think that everyone needs to do when they use market data is actually intentionally define what your market is. What do you mean when you say the market? Because very rarely, I think, does it mean every single property in a geographic radius, right? They could be very simple. It could mean I only want to look at properties that are the same bedroom count. I only want to look at properties that are within a certain radius of mine. But it's very important for you, as a revenue manager, telling a story, that you're intentional about that and you let other people know what that is. And if you're reading market data, that you're doing the same thing. You're asking, like, when they say the market, or they're sharing market data to me, how applicable is that to what I actually think is important, right? The other thing is, know your market data sources. I mentioned before that market data is very fragmented in our space. You often have to put data together, or there are going to be blind spots in that. So again, be intentional not only about what the market is, but where that data is coming from and what assumptions are underpinning that data. If there's a lot of scrape data, how are they treating that? If there are aggregates, how relevant is that to what you're trying to compare to? I always suggest to people to use multiple sources of data. Because market data is imperfect in our space, we have to do a lot of triangulation. And a great way to do that is actually to reference multiple places, right? And see if they're telling a similar story. And not always worry too much about the exact number. I know that's like a weird thing for me to say as an analyst. But not always worry about the exact number, but really try to understand the trend, right? Because again, you're using market data to tell a story. The number is not as important to the audience as what you're actually trying to communicate about the number. What does the number mean to them? What does it imply? How does it explain what you are doing, have done, or trying to do? And the last piece is don't be afraid to use scrape data. It's very useful. Just be aware of when it's being used because that's going to give you a little different idea of how much leeway you're going to give it, right? But I do hear a lot of people say, like, I don't want to use scrape data. Scrape data actually is an advantage in our space for getting market data. I think the industry is getting a lot better at collecting actuals, but it's unlikely that we're going to capture every single property all in one place anytime soon. Okay, so this is a quick one. I'll just skip through this one, but I do want to call out all of my great friends. There's a lot of sources of market data that you can all use. I did mention, despite being a Wheelhouse team member, that you should use multiple sources, not just one. And there's a bunch of great ones that are all here and have done presentations. There's pure data platforms like Key Data, Lighthouse, AirDNA that are all great sources of market data. Your pricing and revenue management systems are also going to be great sources of revenue data. And most of us, I believe, sell this stuff kind of a la carte. So you can access the market data even if you're using a different system for your pricing primarily. And I recommend you check it. Like, we all have different sources. We're all treating it a little different. But at the end of the day, it's useful for you. And the goal is, if you're sharing market data with owners or your boss, you're looking for credibility. Multiple sources are often going to help that. And in some cases, when you start to ask those questions about, like, what are the assumptions underlying this market data, you'll start to see that the different data platforms will sometimes describe different groups of customers. And some of those are going to be better for you. Some of them are going to be a little less relevant. But in some cases, you may infer, like, hey, you know, maybe one source of data has a lot of enterprise or a lot of professionals. One source of data captures a lot of hosts. Even though they're going to give you a little different ideas of what's going on, they're both going to be relevant for helping you explain to an owner or a boss what is going on in a marketplace. So I highly recommend that you look at all of the data platforms here and consider using them. There's also some kind of other data sources that you can go to. Hotel data, I mentioned before, even though we're often looking at short-term rental data to do our underwriting, to explain what's going on, the people who are purchasing our product are often looking at hotels too. And hotel data can have a lot more stability, so it's also a good place to reference if you're trying to understand what's going on in a broader market, right? So I do suggest looking at hotel data if you're in a market that has a lot of hotels. It can be very useful to kind of supplement the data that you're using on a daily basis in short-term rentals. I also recommend going to convention, visitor bureaus, DMOs, a lot of those. This is going to be very different depending on where you're located. There's a lot of different quality levels, but they can share a lot of really great data for you. And one of the big reasons I suggest going to that kind of data, including government data, is credibility, right? Again, market data is often being used to tell a story. You have an agenda here, and credibility and trust is a big element of that. And so if you can back up what you're trying to say with those kind of sources, it can be exceptionally helpful. The last one is honestly news articles, right? This is really true if you're talking to owners in particular. Owners aren't going to want to understand every single piece of data that you can share with them. They kind of want to trust that what you're saying, they want proof that they can trust what you're saying, and news articles can be a great source of that. I know it sounds silly because it's not data that you're going to use all the time, it's kind of ad hoc, but I often pull up news articles to help explain or contextualize for an audience what I'm seeing in the deep data, right? Because I know that that audience isn't going to like look at my Excel sheet and click through every single tab and check all my formulas. They want to trust me, and if I can give them that extra second source, something that gives them that context, it'll be really helpful to just kind of make that case. And if they do want to dig in, I have it available for them. So we got about 10 minutes left, which I think I can use up that time. I'm just going to give you a few examples of what we can do with market data. So that first part was a little bit of philosophy, and the main takeaway is just you have a lot of creative control when you're using market data. We all like to refer to the market as the source of truth or something objective, but just recognize that as a storyteller, you are influencing what you're sharing with people all the time. In terms of like some of the actual use cases of what we do at this, there's a number of them. I'm going to go through a few examples here of things I think that are common. These, I won't go into all the examples, but I do show them. If you do want the slide deck, obviously you can request it from us. We'd love to share it with you. But there's a number of things I think a lot of us are doing with market data other than just listening to great presentations about how their country is doing or what's going on or how the economy is doing in general. All very helpful, but on a practical level, your revenue manager is using this market data to do specific things. And some of these would be forecasting and projections. You can raise your hand if you want to, but I'm sure you all do some form of forecasting and projection. And my guess is you try to utilize market data to underpin that as best as you can and where it's available. Another one is revenue management performance. And so this one would be one more, it's like, I actually think market data, and this is where that kind of storytelling perspective comes in. We use market data a lot to justify what we're doing. And that's why it's really important to not only be accurate, but be aware of like what the market is you're showing, because you can show things that are very, very different if you're not careful. And showing how you're performing compared to other things in your current portfolio is a major piece of where I think people use market data. It's a major piece of how people outside of your revenue management team are going to interface with that market data, right? The other one is revenue management decision-making itself, right? Actually using the market data to make decisions about how you're changing your price and changing your price strategy. And then the last one, I'll probably skip to this one since we're running out of time, is that communication piece. And I think using market data to talk to owners is a really critical element. And not just owners, but other members of your team. Your revenue manager, despite being in charge of your analytics, is actually responsible for informing everyone in the organization what your strategy is, what is going on, and why, right? And that communications piece is really big. So I have a few examples of like ways you can do that, both in terms of just sharing data with owners, but also how do you communicate that strategy and use market data to underpin it. So this first one is forecasting, and the example here is kind of basic in the sense that you're using market data to establish benchmarks for your primary KPIs. And you use those benchmarks to then forecast revenue, forecast RevPAR, whatever it is your main KPI is. At the end of the day, and you'll see this on almost all these examples, it's very, very important to establish what the market is when you draw that data, right? One of the things that I think a lot of people do is, you know, I've mentioned it earlier in this presentation, but if you're going to use market data to forecast revenue, you probably want to use what you're calling the market is going to be properties that are most similar. But you still need enough properties to get an aggregate. So you're not going to be able to find the exact same properties. That means you need to be in the same location. You want to have properties that are generally going to be similar, right? Bedroom count, bathroom count, that kind of thing. And a lot of the things that I think people do here that is kind of implicit, that we do intuitively but maybe don't describe, is you usually are picking a specific percentile to compare to, right? If you pull market data across all of the hosts and all of the professionals, sometimes those numbers will look a lot lower than what you actually want to compare to. So understanding how, you know, what revenue percentile or what level of quality of listing you're going to include in that aggregate to get that benchmark is really important, and it's something you actually have a lot of control over, right? I kind of joke back when I was in my Stay Alfred days, we tried to be very accurate in what we reported to people, but sometimes you would come up against competitors who would show different slices of data. We'd be like, hey, we're going to compare to what we consider to be the 80th percentile because that's where we're trying to operate. And then as we're competing for these properties, someone else would be like, well, they said they're 50% above the market. It was like, well, what is that market, right? It wasn't just the 80 percentile. They were just comparing to everything. So being able to establish that is going to be really important for you. And it's integral that you also explain it when you do that. So anyway, when you're doing forecasting, you're going to gather that market data. You're going to be very specific about what you think is important. And then I add this part, you apply assumptions at the end. And here's an example of that. There's a lot of different ways to do this. If you want to talk through them, I wanted to just give you an example. But in this case, I pulled occupancy rates for the market. In this case, I defined the market as Rome, 2 bedrooms, within a certain radius of central Rome. And in this case, I used market data for the occupancy, but then I used my own portfolio data for the ADR. So you can kind of mix and match. But the reason I point these out is I want to be able to explain that to anyone asking, right? Or maybe you do calculate it in different ways and try to, again, triangulate, try to duplicate. Because the point is you're trying to build credibility. You want to trust these numbers, and there's nothing that's going to give you an exact answer. And if I change the criteria, you know, from 80th percentile, or maybe I go to 3 bedrooms in Rome, it's going to change everything here. So as you're doing these things, the thing I'm just trying to hammer in is be very aware of and intentional of the choices you're making when you're using market data. Ask your revenue manager to write them down for you. If you are a leader or someone who has to explain this to someone else, ask about it yourself so that you can explain what's going on. So there's one example, forecasting. The next one is revenue management performance. And revenue management performance, I think, is when people ask questions like, how are we doing against our competition? Are we capturing our share of demand? Where do we perform in the market? Where do we sit? What percentile we're in? And in these examples, you can use market data, and it's going to be very similar. You're going to compare it to your own KPIs. And the key is the market data you pull to make that comparison has to be relevant, and you are choosing it. Because if I choose to compare to the entirety of the market, that's going to be very different than if I choose to just compare to the top performers in a marketplace, right? So you have to not only understand your audience, but understand where you're getting that data. So I have an example here of just me showing my previous performance. I have the market occupancy and the market ADR, and then I have my occupancy and my ADR. And I did this for an aggregate, right? You could do this for individual listings. You could do that for this, for whatever. But again, the key is, and you're just going to keep saying it over and over again, it's very important what you choose as the basis for your market data. Because you can't just type into Google, give me the market. It's not going to be that relevant to you. Okay, so I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip through this. Decision-making, pacing, using market data to understand pacing. This one I think is pretty interesting because I tend to promote as a revenue manager that you focus more on occupancy when you're doing forward-looking stuff, right? You're really trying to use market data to get an idea of where sales are occurring in the market, and if you have an opportunity to either capture that sales or to adjust and kind of beat the market. So different people will do different things, but I tend to suggest when you're using market data to make future revenue management decisions, your first order of KPI is going to be an occupancy or room night-based KPI, and then you can start to break it down into like how do your rates compare and stuff like that. Here's just a picture of that. It's kind of a, you know, I'm sure looks like chaos, but in purple I have the nights that have my occupancy by day, highlighting what days are like how recently that's been sold, and I'm also showing that occupancy pickup for the market. So you can use that, you overlay the market data and say, hey, where are things getting sold? Am I also seeing those sales in my portfolio? If I'm not, do I need to make an adjustment? Or if I'm selling a lot and the market's not, why is that, right? You're basically using the market data to generate questions that, as a revenue manager, you're going to try to answer. Again, what you choose for the market data is going to be really important, right? And in these cases, I think, especially for future-looking things, it's not always as important to look at the exact same properties. That is something to consider, but I think location tends to be one of the most important aspects. You've got to get your location right here. For anyone who has ever operated in where there's a big concert, you'll know that sometimes 1, 2, 3, 4 miles out from a stadium can make a huge difference. And if you really control the locations you're looking at for that market data, you're going to get really different perspectives of what that market data is going to tell you. Almost done, right? This last one is communication with owners. So I'll just skip to this. Sharing owner performance, giving them context in the market is really, really an important thing. The thing I think that's most important, and I'll send it to you, is I think something everyone should do as a revenue manager is to look at a high level what's going on in the markets at a strategic level and say on a monthly or quarterly basis, what do I think is happening in the marketplace and how would I describe that to people, right? What is a simple way for me to say, this is what I think is happening and this is what I think is going to happen? Generally when I do this, I suggest to people that you really just focus on occupancy because you're trying to get an assessment of how is demand going in this market. A lot of the market data that people shared with us throughout this conference gives you some of that. Using news articles are kind of giving you the ability to articulate what do I think is going to happen, right? Are things getting better or worse? I tend to suggest focusing on occupancy because if you're going to share this with owners or share this with teams like owner-facing teams who maybe aren't pure analysts, occupancy is something that most people can understand, right? If occupancy is up year over year, things are probably going pretty decently. If occupancy is down, they're not. And when you do this, find a way to take that kind of like high-level viewpoint and boil it down into just a few talking points, right? A few bullet points that you can use to describe what you see, what you think is going on, and what that actually means for what you're going to be doing. And this is something that I think if you're doing this on a regular basis, you can explain to your own leadership team what you're doing as a revenue manager, and especially to your owners, right? And the key is to boil it down into being simple. I think this framework of observation, assessment, and impact is really, really important, right? So if I'm just showing them something simple like occupancy, I can say, hey, occupancy's been down all year. I think it's getting worse in the fall from the pacing. What does that mean? You can include other things. We've been maintaining our performance by doing this, but I also think that things are going to get worse. So what does that mean for you? Expect to see us cut our rates earlier than you have seen, right? You're telling them what you're going to do, and you're giving them something to build a little credibility around that. And you're at least giving them the opportunity to disagree with you, right? So that you can have that conversation with an owner. And the nice thing about taking this kind of impact when you do it market by market, I think, is that you can start sharing it regularly and building that credibility with people, whether it's your own owner-facing team so they can explain what's going on. But the hardest thing for a revenue manager is to take all these really detailed things you're doing and actually make it concise so that someone else can understand it and not have to get super bored. So I highly recommend, if you're going to take away anything, it's on a regular basis, look at things from a strategic level and ask the question, how are things going? Can I explain that using just simple occupancy? And how do I boil that down into 3 bullet points that I can send to owners every month, that I can send to my leadership team so that when they look, they kind of understand or have an idea at a top level why I'm doing the things I'm doing, right? I'm going to cut the rates because I think things are getting worse. It's one sentence. Your owner-facing team can say that to the owners. So anyway, I appreciate your guys' time. I'm a little over. The big thing I want to take away here is the assumptions you make are critical. You're making them all the time when you use market data. And if you would like this presentation, come see us at the Wheelhouse booth. I'd love to chat. Thank you, guys.